Okay. Okay. So we are live here on YouTube. We are live here on Instagram. Welcome in. Hope you guys are having a wonderful, wonderful Thursday. Side note. So last week I noticed the audio went out. Sometimes this microphone gives me glitches. So what I'm going to do, at least on YouTube. So if I get a chance, I will go back and I will upload last week's video from the Instagram account. So I'll download that. The audio is not going to be as good, whatever, but at least it'll be something that you could hear. And I'll put it up on here on YouTube. So I will get a chance to do that. I did recognize it. I apologize for that if you were watching it on YouTube. But either way, we have it. So what's going on? Nice to see you, Christine. So with that, this week's really exciting. So we've been building up the last couple weeks. If you've been following along, we were getting to talking about mitochondria, but we had to start a little bit further away from that. Now, if you remember, 2 weeks ago, we actually started with photosynthesis. Now, why did we start with photosynthesis? It's very simple. It's because without photosynthesis, we do not have mitochondria. We do not have the function of mitochondria. And if you look at it, if you go back to, the science classes you took in 3rd and 4th grade, we all learn this and we forget and we don't put the importance of it together. And I certainly am a victim of this as well, is we have photosynthesis, which is again chloroplasts taking light energy using water and CO2 to create oxygen and then glucose. Mitochondria effectively reverse that process. We take the glucose in the form of food, right? Sugars, in the form of, say, fruits and vegetables, oxygen, which we need because that's in the electron transport chain. And then we create water and CO2 so that the cycle repeats itself. So it actually is the cellular respiration. What we talk about in mitochondria is effectively the reverse process of what chloroplasts do, of photosynthesis. So it's important to look at them. And this is why when we talk about, biology and we talk about all these things that go along, like we have to understand that all of this stuff is connected. And even though we're going to go into some of the science stuff, like this stuff is it's nature prefers, in my opinion, simplicity. So we have to look at it from that lens. Do you want to make things complicated, or is it just the lens we're using to look at it? So that's an important, lens we want to look through. So like what mitochondria effectively do, they take sunlight, because this is what's going to power what that does. We're going to take sunlight and it's going to build separate charges. So we know water is a polar molecule, right? We have a negative end, which is the oxygen end. We have hydrogens at the bottom. If you look at the traditional, representation of it, it's positive. And effectively, water is going to be the transducer for radiant energy or sunlight that we could use for energy, whether it's physicochemical energy, optical energy, in other words, creating light, or physicochemical energy, what we use to create sound, and water is a transducer of sound, electrical energy, as we see in the electron transport chain, mechanical energy, so doing work, right? Muscle contraction, moving your arm, and then radiant energy in the form of heat. So there's a lot of things that we can actually turn light into. And this is all done with mitochondria. Now, mitochondria have a bunch of different functions within the body. They make ATP, which we talk about. In my opinion, even more importantly, they create intracellular water. And this water is not the same water that we see, here in this bottle. The water inside our body is not the same. It is more viscous. It is more like a gel. We make CO2, right, to perpetuate the life cycle. So that's why we breathe off CO2. That's why we need plants. So, that's what allows life to exist. It's also part of it. It makes pregnenolone. It will modify gene or DNA expression. And that's also due to light inputs. That's why it's really important to get skin exposure, to get eye exposure to light, especially outdoor light, sunlight, because that's the full spectrum. They act as sensors for the environment, both internal and external. Uh, they can sequester, believe it or not, intracellular calcium to help find that balance. Mitochondria play an important role in autophagy and apoptosis, and they help regulate the immune system. And if you want to learn more about what mitochondria do, you could look into some of like the YouTube lectures by Doug Wallace. Doug Wallace is actually the guy that figured out that the mitochondria, our mitochondrial DNA, I should say, because we have two sets of DNA technically. We have our DNA, our nuclear DNA, but then we have mitochondrial DNA, and our mitochondrial DNA is only passed down from the mother. It's on the maternal side of things. Doug Wallace is actually the guy who figured that out. So, in order to get into some of this stuff with mitochondria, like we have to take a little bit further of a look at biology and physics and why this is important. Because, again, if we understand the why, the how starts to make more sense. And then we could talk about why some of this stuff is helpful as we'll get into some solutions at the end of this. So, first, we have to go back to math class. Now, I hope some of you are into math a little bit, but we had the commutative property. If you remember that, x plus y equals y plus x. This is important because if you go to physics, what is the one physics equation we all remember, right? It's Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. What that effectively means is that mass and energy are interchangeable. What that also means, though, is that they are impacted by light. Now, light, if you remember, is a constant. We use a constant in a vacuum. It's 3 times 10 to the eighth, if you remember. It's more specific than that, but let's use that for now. Now, what's interesting, if you go back to that physics class, now that's in a vacuum, assuming the medium that light is moving through is the same throughout. As we know, that's not true because if I, put a, pencil or a pen in this water bottle and it's on an angle, you're going to see that it almost looks like the pen is broken. That's called refraction. So, in other words, as light passes through a translucent medium, it's going or different medium. So, in this case, from air to water, it's going to bend in a different direction, and we see this all the time. But what happens is when it goes to a denser environment, in this case, from air into water, it's actually going to literally bend the light. Now, what also happens is that also means that the speed of light changes. So, in other words, when we bring light into the body, say through the eyes, and most of our eyes are a liquid inside the eyeball, it's a vitreous humor, they call it. This is We literally bend light to use it in the eye. Now, this is really important because this bent light is going to allow certain things to trigger in, say, certain mitochondria that are going to allow certain things to happen. So, this is why if you go back to some of the light blogs that I wrote on my website, it kind of explains this in a little bit more. But initially, what I'm saying is, as it passes through more viscous or more or for different fluids, even and if this is infrared light, even though it's invisible to us, it sends signals to mitochondria in cells to do different jobs. So in our cells, in our skin, or deeper inside, it would actually be infrared because infrared penetrates deep enough to effectively touch every part of our body. So it can communicate with those cells. This is what charges that EZ zone that we talked about last week. So I'm hoping over these weeks, like this stuff is stacking up. So it's making more sense because it kind of builds on each other. Now, what does this have to do, say, with mitochondria? Recall that we talked a little bit about last week that we are effectively semiconductors at the end of the day, and we use water and carbon to charge those semiconductors. This is what allows us to propel electricity. And we talked about how there's effectively a fourth phase of water that has a liquid crystal structure that allows for this passing of electrons, literally for electricity to flow in the body. This is what allows the mitochondria to create more of this water so that we can become that we can use more electricity in the body. And that's effectively what is happening in the electron transport chain. Yes, it's using ATP to some degree to power certain things, but I would argue even more so, it's creating this water, this deuterium depleted water, which is heavy water, this light water, which transduces electrons more easily, creates a charge separation so that you can actually create a water battery. So what does that mean? It means that we are water beings charged by light, and that light is the sun and especially infrared. Why? It's because this communication allows the mitochondria to do what they do. Now, what another thing that Doug Wallace found is that basically all chronic issues essentially have a mitochondrial component to it. So if there is a higher heteroplasmy rate, which is effectively a as mitochondria within each cell start to change a little bit, that's going to lead to more quote unquote dis-ease because they're not working the same way that they once were, or they're starting to change their structure a bit. So when you see heteroplasmy rates rise to generally above 70%, that's when what we call dis-ease starts to play in or come into play. So this is all really important. Now, in the electron transport chain, as we've talked about before, this is in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. There's essentially a series of 4 proteins, technically 5 if you count ATP synthase, but that take electrons from the Krebs cycle, from the TCA cycle, using NADH. These protons get shunted out into the outer material. That creates an acidic zone, which is what you want. But the electrons are effectively what are used to finally be accepted by oxygen and ultimately water. So in the matrix, you're actually having water created with these electrons and then using those protons coming back in to create ATP from ADP. And all ADP is the same thing as ATP, just with a broken off phosphate group. It's diphosphate and triphosphate, which is 3. And that last one is what breaks off and ultimately gets used for energy. That's effectively what's going on. What's important though is that these electrons that are being used in NADH, they are very highly reduced. In other words, they have a very high redox potential when they're going in. They have a lot of energy, and throughout, and essentially what happens when we're talking about redox potential, electrons move from more negative values to less negative values. So it starts around, say, negative 300, 400, moves down to negative 200, moves down to 0, and then moves into the positives. But effectively, it wants to go from more negative to less negative. And ultimately, it gets to around plus 800 or so. And ultimately, you end up with water. But this water is different, like I said, because now this is the water that's going to be used when it's charged by infrared light to create that liquid crystalline structure that occurs when infrared light is present. Well, it occurs without it, but even more so with infrared light. So effectively, what I'm saying is the more electrons we get in from grounding, from higher biophotonic foods, which are effectively fruits and vegetables, you get more electrons. This means you have a stronger net negative charge, which is what you want. We know the Earth, we've talked about this before, the Earth's surface is negatively charged. So every time we ground, we get more electrons. This creates a stronger battery, a greater capacitor, and then effectively you end up with healthier cells. So the more electrons you have, the healthier cells you ultimately end up with. And that's effectively what's happening here. Now, what are some of the things that are going to cause high heteroplasmy rates, cause mitochondrial dysfunction? There are going to be things like poor circadian rhythms, pesticide consumption, artificial blue light exposure, especially outside of daytime, so especially at night. Too many uh, reactive oxygen species or reactive nitrogen species. Not enough antioxidants, whether from sunlight, whether from grounding, or from fruits and vegetables, which is primarily where your antioxidants are going to come from, reduced oxygen flow or poor breathing patterns. This is why I'm such a stickler for talking about nasal breathing all the time. And if sleep apnea or snoring is in the picture, like you have to get that under control. Um, a lack of easy water, which is again what you build up as part of this, that exclusion zone. And if you go back to the blog from last week, you can read more about it. I don't want to spend too much time with it today. And then reduce subcellular melatonin. Now we're going to get to that a little bit too as we talk about how do we restore it. So how essentially what do we do? And now we're getting to the point here is like how do we restore that mitochondrial function? One of those things is to get more subcellular melatonin. Now I've talked about this in the past, is most of the melatonin in your body right now is not created from the pineal gland and distributed from the brain. That's not actually what happens. It is triggered by exposure to near infrared light, which is from the sun. And because why near infrared? Because it penetrates deeper into the skin. It could get into all the cells, but more importantly, it's not actually in the pineal gland. It is in the mitochondria of every single cell in our body. You take a sip of water here. So, in other words, we create melatonin in our bodies. Now, why is this important? Now, we talk about melatonin a lot as an antioxidant, or sorry, as a sleep, the hormone of sleep, the hormone of darkness. But reality, what it really is a major, major antioxidant in the body. And I'd argue it's more important than even glutathione. Why? Because actually, in these mitochondria, again, over 95% of the melatonin in our body is created in the mitochondria, and it's actually used on site in the mitochondria to put out the fire of these reactive oxygen species as they're created in the electron transport chain. So, in other words, if you're not getting infrared light exposure from the sun, you're not creating the melatonin you need to limit the reactive oxygen species, and they're going the free radicals, and they're going to cause some damage if they're not balanced out. In other words, we're not getting the blue, red, or the IR UV balance that we really need. That's effectively how you can do this. And this is the mechanism is triggering melatonin production inside each one of our cells. That's actually what's going on um, inside each mitochondria. It's super fascinating stuff. What's another thing that can really help? It's grounding. Like I mentioned before, um, the Earth's surface actually has a negative charge. What does that mean? It is full of electrons. We can tap into that virtually unlimited supply of electrons by simply stepping on the earth, stepping on cement, sand, going for a swim. We get these electrons that not only we could add into the electron transport chain, but they also provide that balance from that highly acidic, highly protonated area. In other words, they provide the counterbalance. If we don't have the electrolytes, the electrons we need, we're not going to find that balance. This is why I talked about last week. Like, we need to stop looking at food as carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. We actually have to look at it as what foods are going to help push electrons through the electron transport chain and build that proton gradient so that you can create this structured water that you actually need. Grounding is a fantastic tool to help boost that mitochondria function. Another one is near infrared and red light exposure. Now, we know red wavelengths. Now, I'll have uh, a visual for this in the blog tomorrow, but effectively, red light and as wavelengths get longer, so shorter wavelengths, blue, violet, ultraviolet, longer wavelengths, dermis, or sorry, red, infrared, near infrared, infrared, those penetrate deeper into each cell and they could actually stimulate the movement of the electron transport chain. In other words, they push mitochondria to be more efficient because they actually get deeper into us. So it's able to reach those cells to be like, okay, hey, we got to put more work in. Infrared allows for that charge separation, which essentially creates a more powerful battery. And the bigger battery you have, the more energy you can produce. This is why some of the benefits you'll see with infrared, they're going to include increased metabolism, weight loss or healthy weight gain, depending on where you're at. It's anti-inflammation. It helps with muscle soreness uh, and delayed onset muscle soreness as well. So DOMS, if you ever hear it, that's like feeling sore after a workout. Joint pain and stiffness. Improves skin appearance, promotes collagen growth, helps against other serious disease like cellulitis or eczema or vitiligo or other skin conditions. These are all infrared UV imbalances here. Skin, muscle, extracellular detox, aiding organs and removing waste. So they're going to help with detox, help reduce overall stress. We know that UV and blue lights actually are a stressor on the body. So if we're constantly in front of screens, especially at night, that's going to raise your cortisol levels. That's going to raise your blood sugar levels uh, just by being in front of those, whether you're aware of it or not. So all of these are benefits of just using near infrared light or even red light therapy. Again, you could get near infrared by just going out in the sun. If you actually want to use like a near infrared sauna or something like that, there's actually a code. I have a code for one of them if you want to check it out. But you don't need much. It could be like 15 to 20 minutes, 1 to 3 times a week, to help to get that, if you're using an infrared sauna blanket or another piece or what have you, if that's something you want to use as part of your regimen. For more specific things, you could use certainly more targeted stuff too. Um, whether it's like injuries and stuff like that, you could be a little bit more targeted with it. But generally speaking, that's going to go a long way to help boost mitochondria and energy production to do the job to allow cells to do the jobs that they need to do. The next one's a strong circadian rhythm. This is why these all go together. So again, goes with the blue light that we were talking about before. If we're exposing ourselves to blue light at night, screens, etc., that's going to throw off our internal circadian rhythm. That's going to throw off the clock that we have in our brain. That's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's essentially the clock that allows all cells to do what they do at the time they're supposed to. I don't know if you guys know this, but actually mitosis cycles in the body are generally on 24-hour cycles. They're synced to our body clock almost to a T. So whether we're getting light at the wrong time of the day or we're not getting light during the day, I'm going to go a really long way. So, blue blockers I'm a big fan of. I like the raw optic ones are the ones that I use. Sunglasses are a real problem, especially during the day. This is a big reason why sunscreen is a problem, other than the toxins in it, the phthalates, parabens, heavy metals, etc., that you find in most conventional sunscreens. The other problem is it actually doesn't let the light in. This is specifically UV, but you also use that for different reasons. But this also sends those signals. Hey, it's daytime. Hey, this is what we need to be doing this time of day. And wearing sunglasses, wearing sunscreen actually blocks those signals and can throw off your internal clocks. Being behind a glass window like I am now, most modern day glass does the same thing. Most glasses do it. Contact lenses have UV protection. So if you're not getting this at the right time of day when you should be, it's going to affect your internal rhythms and internal clocks. This is going to throw off your circadian rhythm. So minimizing that is really important. You want to make sure that you're getting light exposure first thing in the morning. You should be up just before the sun gets up or as the sun gets up and expose as much skin as possible to the sun every morning. Ideally, no glasses, no sunglasses, no contact lenses if possible. And that should be part of a daily routine. Um, I would minimize wearing sunglasses as much as possible. Ideally, throw them out. They're a big problem with this. They will leave you more prone to sunburns, believe it or not, because you're essentially tricking your body into thinking it's later in the day than it is. Sunset. Same thing in the morning. I would say morning exposure is more important than sunset, but same deal. And then after it goes down, make sure lighting at night is low and it's in the redder spectrum if you have to have lights on. What were the only lights that we used 100 or so years ago at night? It was, fireplaces, campfires, candles. That was literally all that was available. Maybe not 100, but 150 years ago. That was it before the invention of the light bulb. And the incandescent bulbs actually did a better job at getting some of those uh, wavelengths. The newer lights do not do that. They're causing problems because we're not getting the full spectrum we should. And again, if you want to check out the blog post I wrote on it, you could check this out. So that's a big one. Another thing you might want to do is help improve the redox potential of these mitochondria. Now, how do you do that? We talked about redox potential. What is that? That's effectively how well your body is moving electrons from more negative areas to more positive areas. That's the very minimalist way to put it. Um, and this is done by creating that proton gradient. So we use the electrons to shuttle the protons out, but those electrons are essentially what power it and make water. So, if redox potential is low, what are some signs and symptoms you might have? It could be loss of libido, it could be poor sleep, poor quality of your hair, skin, and nails, cataracts or blue light toxicity in general, low potassium levels, chronic hormone imbalances, cortisol and melatonin imbalances, so circadian rhythm, low glutathione stores, low selenium stores, low hemoglobin or hematocrit levels. These are all potential signs of low redox potential. So, what are some ways we can improve that redox potential? We already touched on some. Infrared therapy can certainly be one. Iodine rich seaweeds, I think, are a fantastic option. You definitely want to be avoiding alcohol as much as possible. Um, Avoiding fluoride as much as possible. So, fluoride free toothpaste. Get a water filter that can filter as much of it out as possible. Lower stress, intermittent fasting, avoid unnecessary non-native EMF sources. Done blogs on that. So you could check out literally a whole blog on ways to do that. Antioxidant rich and high biophotonic energy foods. Again, lots of fruits and vegetables all go a long way. And then pay attention to your light environment at night and after sunsets. So all of that is going to help improve that redox potential, that mitochondria function. Now, why fluoride intake? Why is that a problem? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of the biggest ones, again, if you go back to chemistry and physics, is this concept of electronegativity. And fluoride is essentially the most electronegative element we have. What that essentially means is it wants electrons. It takes electrons from things and can have a bunch of downstream reactions down the road. One of the reasons that fluoride is really bad for thyroid health specifically is because all of those halogens, chlorine, bromine, iodine, fluorine, they're all in the same column if you look at the periodic table. And effectively, they all compete for a lot of the same binding sites. Fluorine essentially has a stronger pull because it is more electronegative. So if they're competing, fluoride a lot of the time is going to take those spots. So this is why you see that, like, you could see that the real damages on thyroid health, on brain function. We know it's a neurotoxin. This has even been said by the ADA. It's in their own documents on their website. You want to be limiting your exposure to this as much as possible. And it's even more electronegative than oxygen. Now, oxygen, generally speaking, is the most electronegative atom that we use a lot of in the body. Fluoride outcompetes it because it's more electronegative. It's a little bit different, but more so with the halogens. But this is why it has those effects. It's much more polar. It has that more of that pull. So This is why you want to limit that exposure as much as possible. So if you can get access to a water filter, you want to opt for spring water. If, ideally, if you can, get a toothpaste that is free of fluoride. All of these are going to be great. The other thing that's really important is reducing non-native EMF exposure. Now, I don't eat meat anymore, but here's a good example because I think we don't take a lot of non-native EMF exposure seriously. But if there's a thought experiment, is basically is what happens if you say take a steak that you made last night or whatever, and you put it in the microwave, and then what happens to it at the end? At the end, it gets dried out. It's effectively dehydrating it to heat it up. The water molecules are basically shaken and they're moving, which generates heat. But that ultimately that those water molecules become vapor, literally vaporized, turned into vapor to generate heat, and that effectively dries it out. That's why if you put, say, a piece of meat, for example, in the microwave, it ends up getting dried out and rubbery. That's effectively what's happening at a lesser degree, but more constant degree with these non-native EMFs all the time. They effectively are slowly dehydrating the body. And what have we been talking about pretty much this whole time? Water, charge separation, and creating water in mitochondria. So, hydration is not just about the water you drink, it's about what you eat, it's about your environment, and it's about how well these mitochondria are pumping electrons through a chain so that we can use the water we already have. Because, like I mentioned before, the water inside of us is not the water you see in this bottle. It does not look like this and it does not necessarily act the same way. That's why, if you cut your arm, water doesn't leak out, it's blood, and you notice it's a little bit more viscous. It is not the same consistency as water, or I should say, the liquid water I see here. So, again, full blog post on this. You could look at that. But like, this is why, if you have any unnecessary electronics, I recommend ditching them. The smartwatches, the AirPods, Alexa, um, Aura rings, cordless phones, Bluetooth, Tesla. I would never drive a Tesla or recommend it. All of these things are completely unnecessary. There's no way you're going to get rid of it 100% at this point, but minimizing the exposure that you do have control over, super important. So, those are the big ways that we can enhance our mitochondria's function, how we can get the most out of our body and our cells, and more importantly, like create a healthier environment for ourselves. I hope this like three-part series in general has been helpful on that front. Next week, we're actually going to talk about collagen because that's one of the ways that all this stuff kind of comes together and how things are transduced in the body, which is really cool. But that'll be next week. So, a couple things before we go. If you haven't signed up yet for the Becoming Invincible newsletter, link is in my bio. Please do it. I'm going to be basically talking about this in more detail, written with images and stuff. So, you could see it a little bit better. That'll be coming out tomorrow. So I highly recommend checking that out. It's on my website, insideouthealthwellness.com, or you go to the link in my bio. If you haven't checked out my ebook yet, Nature's Kitchen and Cabinet, awesome way to get started as far as, starting to heal the body. And, if you want to check out brand new free video I put together in 10 minutes, how to reverse insulin resistance, links in my bio. Check it out. It's for free. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll try to get last week's episode up. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, I'll see you guys next week. Have a good one. Okay.